Shalom lekulam. Hello, everyone. I believe we are live on Facebook, on YouTube, on the website. Thank you once again for joining me. My name is Rabbi Ross Levy. I'm the assistant rabbi here at Congregation Kol Ami in what was last time I checked, pretty foggy West Hollywood, California. And here we are at our fifth and final session of exploring the Siddur. Over the course of the past 10 weeks or so, it's hard to believe, we've been exploring many of the different elements that compose a typical Jewish prayer service. We've been walking through what are called rubrics, different little pieces of the service that, depending on the time of year or depending on the time of day, may adjust. But we've been mainly focusing on the morning liturgy, a typical morning service, a weekday service to be specific, and using it as an example, as sort of the most full example of the liturgy, and exploring the different themes, exploring the historical development of the prayer book, talking about how it is very much an anthology of the Jewish people. Over the course of time, we have accumulated different prayers, different texts, different pieces of poems, incorporating biblical texts, incorporating new poetry, creative liturgy, which we think of now as a very modern thing with creative English readings or whatever your vernacular might be. But in actuality, that process of creativity combined with the set, fixed keva nature of our prayer has been that guiding tension where we have the forms that we've inherited and then what we bring in our own unique voice and expressing our own yearnings as human beings, as people living in the world, and all of the above. So this session will be a little bit of recap, a little bit of walking through what we've talked about over the course of the previous four sessions. And it'll offer a little bit of conclusion, and it's fitting because we'll be talking about the concluding prayers of a service, but really specifically talking about the Kaddish. Pretty much every service concludes with the mourner's Kaddish. And we're going to talk about that, sort of the development of the Kaddish, the different roles that the Kaddish plays, and also seeing the Kaddish as this moment of transition from one element, from one rubric, from one period of our lives into another one. So just as a quick, and if you'd like to follow along, and I would highly encourage you to find it, please go to the link that is shared on Facebook or on the Kol Ami website, kol-ami.org, and find the source/song sheet, it's a lot of S's in a row, to follow along with us. And included in there is a link to the digital version of Mishkan Tefillah, the most recent prayer book in our Reform movement. And included throughout, both during this session and in the previous sessions, if you want to go check them out, are page numbers for Mishkan Tefillah, and there are certain moments where I compare what we have in the Reform prayer book with more traditional liturgies. All of that good stuff can be found in the pre-recorded sessions, or previously recorded sessions. So if you look at page 1 of our sheet for today, we see once again this arc of a morning service, and specifically a morning service that includes a Torah service. So traditionally during the week, that would be on Mondays and Thursdays, which in ancient days were actually market days. And so it was the day that people were most likely to be in town, and so most likely to have the necessary quorum for a full service, and for a full Torah service, for Torah to be read aloud. But there's also a teaching that I learned that if you can include Shabbat, you can never go 3 days without Torah, in a similar way that you can't go 3 days without food. But that's neither here nor there. Over the course of the past few sessions, we've gone through the different rubrics, those different blocks on that chart of the different parts of the service. So we started with Birchot HaShachar, and what we focused on there were the themes of gratitude and identity. There's an idea of beginning your day with gratitude, what we in our modern times would refer to as a gratitude practice, perhaps. and in a lot of ways a mindfulness practice, which is also similar to the building of identity, these succession of blessings, offering gratitude for the many different parts of ourselves that lead to who we are, whether it's our physical body, our spiritual essence, or our spiritual body, as it were, our connections with other people, our commitments to the world around us, to making it better, to embracing that divine aspect within ourselves as a way of contributing into the creation and the betterment of the world. All of those things we talked about in the morning. And then from there we moved into Psuke de Zimra, talking about praise, verses of song, which is a succession of, there are a couple blessings that sort of bookmark the beginning and end of it, but it's mostly psalm texts, a lot of poetry, a lot of themes of gratitude, but also there is an importance of singing and beginning your day and bringing you into a prayerful state of mind, a prayerful state of being through the power of song. And so we talked about praise and the importance of sort of using these ancient words and this poetry and connecting with nature and connecting with the divine above us and around us as a way of bringing us into what are the more major parts of the service, or central, I guess I should say. They're all major parts. The first of which being the Shema and its blessings. So we talked about the notion of a narrative being built with the Shema and its blessing, that trajectory from creation to revelation to redemption that we see just in that small part. We talked about the various themes of creation. In the morning, we're talking about the creation of light. In the evening, we're talking about sort of that transition, the rolling of light into dark, and then eventually dark back into light, in the cyclical nature of our world. We talked about the love sandwich, the blessing before the Shema, that talks about sort of the love, the unique relationship between us and the divine, that merited this wisdom that we've been inheriting over the course of generations as Jews. And following that, we have the Ve'ahavta, which is the passage from Deuteronomy, and the Shema and the Ve'ahavta really seen as sort of a core statement of beliefs and a core statement of values, often referred to as a creed. And so we went through that. And then a couple weeks ago, we went through the Amidah, which after concluding a little bit of praise that actually started with Psuke de Zimra, the first couple of blessings of the Amidah are very much praise. We're thanking God for safeguarding our ancestors. We're thanking God for the amazing forces in our world that enable us to live and to breathe and to eat and to be physical bodies in the world. And then we move from there into the succession of petitions, of asking God for things, asking for peace, asking for health, asking for a good year and a good crop, asking for knowledge, asking for all of these many different things. As we go through as we discovered, were 19 blessings, even though it's often referred to as the Shemona Esrei, as the 18. And then that also included the silent prayer. We didn't go through the Torah service. Maybe that could be an idea for an upcoming Exploring the Prayer Book series in the future, perhaps in the springtime, if folks are interested in that. We didn't really talk about the Torah service, but I wanted to conclude, fittingly, with the concluding prayers. Now, we won't be talking about the Aleinu. The Aleinu is fascinating in and of itself. But we're really going to focus on the Kaddish. And the Kaddish is, as we'll come to discuss a little bit more, really one of these touchstones of Jewish ritual life. Even any person who, grew up Jewish or came to Judaism later in life and may have gone away from Judaism for a little time, Kaddish is still something that people would be familiar with. It has such a resonance with certain moments of our lives. And so let's go ahead and dive into the Kaddish, which concludes most of our services. And here I found this passage this quote that sort of speaks to what I was just referring to, which is Kaddish as this touchdown. Now, this is a quote from a rabbi in 1928. So you'll notice that the language is a little bit different. It is very gendered. And it is also more antiquated than the way we would say things now. But I think it speaks to this unique element of the Kaddish. And Rabbi Joseph Schick says, the Kaddish, perhaps more than any other prayer, has become a soul-searching agency which brings back to the Jewish fold's numerous erstwhile indifferent sons and daughters. And we're on page 2 of the packet. Its mysterious charm cannot be rationalized. It perplexes the mind of the theologian and fascinates the mind of the layman. Practical businessmen and women and other genders who otherwise remain unmoved by sentiment melt wax-like when called upon at the demise of a near or dear one to say the Kaddish. And this was quoted by Hannah Worth Nesher in her book Call It English. And this really speaks to this power that Kaddish has. And it's one of those prayers that we don't often translate. Even early in the Reform movement, if you look at those early Reform Siddurim, early Reform prayer books, one of the major things was they wanted prayers in the vernacular. They wanted prayers originally in German or in English eventually when it moved to the United States. And there were a couple that weren't translated. Now, the Shema was translated, but it was also still kept in Hebrew. Even though we do read in the Talmud and the Mishnah that the Shema can be recited in many different languages. And but one that was rarely fully translated was the Kaddish. It was mainly kept in its original language, which we're going to be getting into, which is actually a couple of different languages, and often with transliteration to help people pronounce it. But it speaks to the fact that just the rhythm of saying it and the syllables working together is part of what the power is. And yet, there is a lot of meaning ingrained in the Kaddish. There's the meaning of the words, and then of course there's the meaning of those moments in which we say these special words. So first, as is our tradition here during these sessions, we're going to bring in a little bit of song, and we're going to start with just to bring a little bit of energy into our day, and also a little prayer for peace to begin our day, or whatever time of the day you might be watching this. The magic of technology allows for that. With a little bit of Oseh Shalom Bimromav, which is the final line of the Kaddish prayer. May the one who makes peace on high bring peace to us, to all of Israel, and to all of humanity, to which everyone responds, Amen, affirming that prayer and hoping and praying that it comes to be, that we see that peace. And so before we get too deep into the Kaddish, let's go ahead and sing a little opening melody, a little opening prayer this morning. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'imu, Amen. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'imu, Amen. Ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן. It's a great way to bring a little bit of energy into our day. All right. Continuing talking about the Kaddish, there's a section that I entitled Language, and it actually speaks to one of the linguistic peculiarities, you could say, of Kaddish, which is the fact that it actually blends a couple of different languages. It is primarily in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca, the language that people spoke at the time of the early rabbis, 2nd, 3rd century CE, and later on, continuing in Babylonia. It is the primary language of the Talmud, but it also blends elements of Hebrew. And now this question, once the Kaddish prayer was established as a part of rabbinic Jewish practice, about why do we have different languages, or why is it primarily in Aramaic when the vast majority of the rest of the prayers are all in Hebrew? And in a commentary on the Babylonian Talmud by the Tosafot, referred to in English as the Tosafists, I don't see what the difference between Tosafot and Tosafists is, other than English speakers will more readily understand it, but that's besides the point. We have this commentary on Brachot, one of the main tractates, or one of the probably most well-known and oft-studied tractates of the Talmud, all about blessings and prayer and all of that kind of good stuff that we like to talk about. And they offer an understanding of why it's written primarily in Aramaic. And they write, thus one says Kaddish in Aramaic. Since the prayer is so fitting and such great praise, it was established in the language of the Targum, the vernacular. Targum being Aramaic, or I believe it's actually Hebrew for translation, but the Targum was an Aramaic translation of the Bible that was always accompanied with a public reading of the Torah. So you would read from the Torah, and then someone would read from the Targum in Aramaic so that people could understand it, because people did not understand Hebrew. So that the angels would not understand and become jealous. It is not that there are not other beautiful prayers in Hebrew, but it is apparent, as it is said in Sota 49a, elsewhere in the Talmud, that the world only continues to exist because of the Kedusha de Sidra, these prayers of holiness, the Kedusha and the Kaddish, coming from the same root, and the response Hey Shmei Rabbah after learning, which is the original context that Kaddish comes from. It was originally part of, given at the end of a big learning session in the old Beit Midrash in the Babylonian area, Surah, Pumbedita, a lot of these big major centers of Jewish life and thought that we read about from about the 5th or 6th century through the 9th and 10th century. And the people were accustomed to say Kaddish after a drasha, after a teaching, after potentially being a sermon or a lesson. And being ordinary folk, they did not understand the holy tongue at all. Many drashot, many ancient rabbinic interpretations are actually written in Hebrew, so it would make sense that people wouldn't be able to understand that. And so it was fixed in the vernacular, which everyone understood. So this is them responding to this notion that it was written in Aramaic so as not to make the angels jealous. There's this notion that when we are engaging in prayer, when we're offering praises to God, which is very much what the Kaddish prayer is. If you look at a translation, it's talking about may God's great name be sanctified, be lifted up, be made great in the world. And the idea is that as we're doing that, the ministering angels, the divine beings, as they conceived of them, are doing the same thing. So we're kind of mimicking, or also simultaneously doing the same thing as the angels, but there is a certain jealousy in terms of the angels having this unique relationship with God, and in certain respects in the ancient Jewish mindset, being sort of jealous of these human beings who are sort of lesser, more material beings, being able to offer similar or more powerful praises. This is sort of what's going on in their ancient rabbinic mindset. And they add an element to this, which is that people couldn't understand these things. So when they wanted to do a prayer that concluded a learning session, that concluded a major piece of Jewish life, they wanted something that people would be able to understand. And I think this actually hints to what we see in the modern world and what the Reform movement began doing, which was encouraging the use of vernacular and encouraging the use of the language that everyone speaks in Jewish prayer life, rather than just always doing the Hebrew, which is important in and of itself. We have a very unique relationship with Hebrew. The idea was we want things that people are going to be able to understand and connect with in a much more accessible way. So that's part of the reason why it's predominantly Aramaic, but there's also little Hebrew snippets in there. So for example, what we just sang, Oseh Shalom B'Mromav, that's all in Hebrew. So it's very much sort of this hodgepodge of different languages. Very quickly, I wanted to talk about, there are actually 5 different types of Kaddish. Those who may have grown up in more traditional communities would be familiar with this, but this was very new for me, having grown up in a Southern Classical Reform congregation in Nashville, Tennessee. The notion that there are other forms of Kaddish other than the mourner's Kaddish. So probably the most common one is the Chatzi Kaddish, the half Kaddish, and it's used as a demarcation between certain parts of the liturgy. So you'll see it in between Psukei de Zimra, the verses of song, which we talked about, and the Shema and its blessings, which begins with the Baruch Hu, which really starts the service proper. So oftentimes you will have a Chatzi Kaddish as a way of demarcating. And it started in the Beit Midrash as a way of transitioning between lessons, and it eventually made its way into prayer life as a way of marking transitions from one point of the service to the next. And the different melodies of Kaddish, of Chatzi Kaddish, as well as Kaddish Shalem, often will tell you what time of day and what day of the week. Not necessarily what day of the week, but whether or not you're in the week or if you're in Shabbat. There's different melodies for each one. Then we have Kaddish Shalem, which is usually recited at the end of a major section, so either the Amidah or at the end of the Torah service. It's mostly the same. It has a little bit more to it than the Chatzi Kaddish. It has a couple of extra lines. But again, it's, if the Chatzi Kaddish is a comma, the Kaddish Shalem is more of a period. Now, that's not to say that it ends the entire service, because of course there's still more to do, but it's a more major stopping point and demarcation. Then there's Kaddish de Rabbanan, which is a special Kaddish celebrating teachers and their students. It's usually recited at the end of a special study session. I've seen it done if you're leading a text study in honor of someone that you love who passed away. You will oftentimes recite Kaddish de Rabbanan. At HUC in rabbinical school, we would recite it every once in a while as a way of honoring the learning that we've been doing. And it just speaks to the celebration and really the sacred nature of learning and of study in Jewish culture. And then we have Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. This is probably the best known. It is not sung. It is recited plainly without any melody. And it actually came about in, Kaddish Yatom literally means an orphan's Kaddish, and it actually came about during the Middle Ages, in the wake of the Crusades, or the practice of reciting Kaddish as a mourning ritual, and doing it in every service, eventually became common Jewish practice during the Middle Ages, and primarily as a result of the immense amount of death and suffering that Jews endured during that time. And so there were so many people who were mourning such losses that they decided to make Kaddish a part of that, and it thematically fits, because if we think of Kaddish as this mark of transition, that it also marks the great transition, or one of the great transitions from life into death. And then finally, there's the Kaddish HaGadol, which is very rarely said. It's pretty it's a good bit longer than the mourner's Kaddish, just by a few lines, but it's only recited very traditionally at the graveside, following the interment of a loved one, and upon the completion of a full tractate, a Masechet, a major section of the Talmud. Again, this marking the completion of a journey, marking the completion of a learning. And I wanted to offer this final reading from one of my teachers, Rabbi Dr. Michael Marmer, who wrote an article talking about Kaddish as a speech act, the power that Kaddish has, even if we're not thinking about the meaning, just the power of the syllables and what it means for us to say it in those sad and tragic times when we're remembering people that we love. And he writes, standing on the border between learning and the end of learning, between one liturgical unit and the next, between the words of the Pentateuch, the Torah, and the words of the prophets, between this world and the world of worlds, this speech act acknowledges the borderline and seeks to reach out across it. And about Jews, he writes, faced with a void, our tradition offers language. Faced with the inexpressible, our tradition expresses demarcation, distinction, and connection. Faced with loss and the call of silence, our tradition insists we speak. And I wanted to conclude with that passage because obviously it's talking about the Kaddish. He's talking about faced with loss and the call of silence in this void. But I think it's also fitting to think about prayer in the same way. Faced with a void of a world that so often is beyond our understanding, so often is so chaotic and tragic that words can't even begin to describe it, our tradition, and so many traditions, offers language. We understand that the language that we speak may not be able to encapsulate all of reality or speak to things that we can't perceive, but by vocalizing it, by our tradition insisting that we speak, we are expressing what it is to be human, what it is to struggle with this world that we're living in, what it is to hope, what it is to dream, and the way that we conceive of those dreams and those hopes and those prayers comes from our language. And particularly if you think about Kaddish, you typically needing a quorum of 10 adult Jews to be able to recite it. Also talking about what it means to be in community and how being in community is the best way for us to go through this together. And with that, I wanted to conclude this series in thinking about prayer as this vehicle for thought, this vehicle for spiritual connection, this vehicle for communal connection between all of us coming together, and seeing it as an ongoing process. This language is continually developing. And so I want to encourage everyone who's joined in for any or one of these sessions to explore the prayer book on your own. If you go to services, if you're sitting there, maybe you're a little bit bored, it's okay. Sift through the prayer book. Look at the alternative readings that are there. Look at the history that is being presented to you. The prayer book is an anthology. It's its own museum. Within it, we have words from 3,000, 2,000 years ago. We have words from 1,000 years ago. We have words from 500 years ago. And we have words from just 2 decades ago. It is a museum of the Jewish people. And it is truly one of the joys, at least for me, to be able to explore. And I'm so thankful for everyone joining on. Very thankful, I don't know if he's watching, to our communications manager, Yanir, for helping me set up all these sessions and get all the sheets uploaded and clip it onto YouTube. So thank you so much. And we'll conclude by offering a prayer that the words that we recite, whether we're praying or we're studying, that they're heard, that we feel heard, and that we continue bringing new language into the world. And in that way, bringing new hope into the world. Yehu leratzon imrefi ben yon lefanecha. Adonai tzuri vegoali. Adonai tzuri vegoali. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, Adonai, my rock and my redeemer. Yehu leratson imevi ve'yon libi lefanecha. Adonai tzuri ve'goali. Adonai tzuri ve'goali. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, Adonai, my rock and my redeemer. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'm realizing I haven't said it yet. Happy Hanukkah, Chag Urim Sameach. May the learning we've done here and may your celebration of Hanukkah, if you celebrate it, bring more light and more love into